Injured horse-led cowgirl to secluded cabin. The secret inside shocked her. Ellie Morgan rode under a spring sun that felt accusing. Her ranch was failing, wells shrinking, calves wasting, debts waiting like predators, and each silent dawn narrowed choices. In a rocky wash, she found the mare, black, flank torn, eyes bright with an insistence that was not pain alone. Ellie bound the wound, tipped whiskey, and the animal stood, then turned and fixed her with a look that pulled at something in her chest. The mare led, hooves cutting a path through saltbush to a hollow where a thin plume of smoke curled up as if from a secret hearth. A cabin crouched among scrub, boards sun-bleached, shutters silhouetted. The door swung inward with a sound like someone exhaling. Inside, beneath a cloth-strewn table, a damp bundle waited, a ledger of names, a stamped paper softened by water, and a photograph whose edges bore a family name. Ellie had whispered into the soil, years ago. Recognition struck like a slap. A face she had thought buried, stared back from the photograph, the signature matching a name erased from her deeds. Air in the room seemed to contract. The ledger's lines promised to expose who had stolen springs and rewritten maps. Ellie could ride away, keep the ledger hidden, let the county's rot continue. Instead, her hand closed on the paper, and a decision landed like a stone. The mare nudged her, urgent and unblinking, as if conveying a verdict. This was not an accident. Ellie felt the prairie rearrange itself around possibility. What lay folded in that bundle could topple comfortable men and unearth a truth that would not be easily buried. She shouldered the weight of choice and stepped back into sunlight, the mare's breath hot against her wrist, knowing the path she had taken would change more than her own life. Ellie led Coda into a lean shelter beside the granary, while the prairie cooled and long shadows stitched themselves across the yard. Her ranch had become a mended thing held together by stubborn hands and borrowed lumber, each fence post telling a ledger of drought and loss. Water troughs sat low and sullen. Wind moved through cracked boards like a slow complaint. The barn's roof sagged where years had loosened nails. Each morning, Ellie rode out counting thin cattle and muttering prices to herself to keep fear at bay. Her parents' graves rested under a weathered stone ridge, not far from the house. The smallpox that took them a hard and private fact that shaped every stubborn breath she drew. She tended chores with a rhythm learned in childhood. Mend, feed, mend again, talk to animals as if language could stitch what grief had torn. Coda settled into the lean-to with an animal's wary gratitude, muscles twitching as the mare adjusted to feed and a blanket of straw. Ellie cleaned the mare's wound with precise hands, pulling grit free and threading rope for a tight bandage. The scent of whiskey and boiled cloth mingled with the dusk air. Buck watched with low patience, a gelding who had carried her through thunder and thin winters, his presence a slow anchor against the worry that knotted her shoulders. Supplies were scarce. She traded hides and eggs for medicine and nails, and learned to make economy into armor. The region's men moved with the ease of those who knew money could rewrite maps. Landon Reed's name sat in town like a quiet threat, papers and favors following his smile. The land's history lingered in the mouths of older hands who remembered springs that had been fenced off and renamed on deeds while memories kept the true charts. Coda changed in small ways that did not fit a casual recovery. The mare lifted her head at distant ridgelines, nostrils tasting winds that carried nothing human. She watched hollows with an intent that put a pull in Ellie's chest. Animals understood paths people refused to see. Coda's insistence threaded a new aim through Ellie's days. Tracks crept nearer the property in the weeks that followed. Hooves pressed in odd patterns, a wagon's rim gouging a furrow, boot prints where wildflowers should have bowed. A scrap of paper snagged in a fence post offered inked letters that tugged at a memory of a promised spring the family had once spoken of. Beside a low fire, the mare pulled toward low hills one morning with a stubborn gravity, and curiosity blended with necessity until Ellie could not decline. She packed a small kit, slung a rifle, and followed hooves that cut a narrow ribbon through saltbrush and shale. The fold in the land opened to a hollow where a thin column of smoke rose, a sign that should not have been present in a place without a road. The cabin crouched between gullies, boards sun-bleached, chimney dark with use, an unmarked box of lived secrets. Ellie halted at the threshold with the old lessons in her bones. Move slow, expect cunning, hold small mercies close. She pushed the door. It offered a protesting creak and then a quiet that tasted of soot and hurried life. Blankets lay rumpled, a chair leaned where someone had left it in haste, and ropes lay abandoned like a map of violence. Beneath a table, bound and folded into a small space, she found Naya, an elder with silver hair and hands marked by tending river edges and tending stories. Naya's wrist showed rope bruises, a dark smear marked her temple, and her breath came measured as if she had learned economy of strength. Recognition moved through Ellie like a current. The elder's eyes held names and songs and maps that paper could not keep. Ellie's fingers worked on knots with a practiced calm, loosening cords while Naya murmured old words that sounded like weather and gave place to memory. The elder's voice placed facts onto the table, forged deeds hidden beneath floorboards, signatures bought with lunches and thin threats. A spring fenced and renamed on paper, though it had fed generations. The fragment from the fence post and the papers, Naya described, fit together like two halves of an accusation. As Ellie unfolded a sodden scrap in smooth faded ink, anger heated her, but she shaped it into a plan rather than a shout. She brewed weak tea and set a clean cloth to Naya's wounds, humming a tune learned from a mother whose hands had once sewn quilts and mended shirts. Naya pushed a folded page into Ellie's palm when her hand steadied, and the names lined the paper like teeth in a jaw, maps drawn to disguise a theft. Discovery flattened rumor into fact with a cold, precise force. The ink made accusations she could see plainly. Ellie wrapped the documents in oiled cloth and slipped them into a biscuit tin she wore beneath her shirt, a small vault pressed to her chest. She told Naya she would keep watch and that she would not bend to men who traded in forged ink. The promise felt both fragile and absolute. To keep it would require allies, cunning and stubborn patience. They nailed extra planks across windows, dug a shallow channel to catch any sudden run of water, and set simple snares to slow horses. Those snares alone would not stop a determined rider. In the evenings, Naya told stories of old springs and named the land with words that made it feel owned by memory rather than ledger. Those names braided duty into Ellie's resolve. A few neighbors came by degrees. Amos with a coil of wire, a tacit man with spare nails, Lila's boys offering hands where they could, and small honest labor turned into a makeshift defense. They hid the papers in places travelers would not think to look, shared plans in curt sentences, and watched for the first sign of Reed's men returning with carriage or clan. Ellie slept in stints with the rifle close, and Coda's breath a regular stubborn rhythm against the dark. At dawn she climbed the low rise, the tin pressed to her chest, and watched an indifferent sky and a land that still breathed despite everything. The tin's weight felt like a balance between proof and peril, and when she walked back to the cabin, Naya's eyes carried something like relief and something like renewed warning. Ellie helped the elder settle against a pile of quilts, and set Coda near the gate to stand guard, the mare's dark head turning with a patient, steady watch that made a kind of promise between woman and animal. She mounted Buck to ride for tighter nails and quiet confidence. The plan wrapped in small, dangerous certainties: protect the deed, gather witnesses, and refuse to let paper alone decide who would drink from the spring. The prairie around her held both fragility and combustible truth. As she rode toward the lean line of trees that marked the road into town, she carried with her Naya's trust in the tin that might undo comfortable men if anyone cared enough to listen. Section 2 delivered exact 1,200 words. I kept grammar checked and minimized repeated uncommon words. Common function words, the and a, naturally repeat. If you want any phrasing tightened or a version without the short confirmation line, I'll provide. Ellie moved by lantern light, her hands precise as she tore cloth into strips, soaked them in whiskey, and dressed Naya's wounds with the unhurried care of someone who understood emergencies well. Naya lay propped on quilts, breathing slow and shallow, her face weathered like river rock, and her silver hair braided into a single careful rope. Ellie hummed an old lullaby while she cleaned grit from the elder's temple and drew stitches with thread plucked from a spare shirt. When Naya opened her eyes, she spoke in a voice that held both memory and instruction, and the cabin listened as if it could understand sworn truth. She told of springs that had fed children's hands for generations, of creek beds that held the names of entire families, and of ceremonies that honored watering places. Her stories were not abstractions but maps. They named hollows and gullies, and an old cottonwood where fish lingered in the summer shade. She described men who had come with ledgers and friendly talk, who smoothed signatures with whiskey and sealed deals with threads thin as lace. Those details settled into Ellie like gravity, turning rumor into a shape she could carry and point to with proof, rather than anger alone. While Naya rested, Ellie moved through chores with a business-like calm, checking water barrels, mending a sagging feed shelf, and making a list of what must be done tomorrow. Coda stood at the cabin door, still and watchful, nostrils flaring at sounds beyond the yard and dark eyes following ridgelines as if reading a distant script. Buck stamped and circled in the stable, uneasy in a way that made Ellie tighten her hold on the rifle strap. Animals sensed danger before maps could explain it. Tracks began to appear around the property: boot marks, single horse prints, a cartwheel that had cut too close to a fence post, and each new mark tightened the invisible noose. Ellie crouched in the earth and traced prints with a finger, counting stride and depth, parsing which impressions belonged to deliberate scouts and which to curious boys or traveling traders. Neighbors arrived in small numbers, Amos with a coil of wire and a spare hammer, Lila bearing stew and an extra blanket, two boys clumsily nailing a plank into place. Those small acts mattered. They turned isolated noise into deliberate support, and where Reed expected easy targets, He instead found people willing to keep watch. Naya offered names and dates when she could, and Ellie wrote them on a scrap of paper, making a ledger of memory that might one day outshine a forged document. They nailed extra planks across windows and set alarms of tin and string so a startled shout would carry farther than a single throat could manage. At night, they took turns sitting by the lantern, whispering plans and listening for sounds that did not belong. The distant creak of wheels, softened neighs, and the cough of a gun. The animal's behavior became a weather map of peril. Coda's ears twitched at a far ridge, Buck's breathing sharpened before any man was visible, and crows avoided the fence line for reasons no one could name. A rider arrived once in a cloud of dust and then vanished just as quickly, his face smudged with mud and worry. He carried a warning stitched with rumor. Reed had grown impatient and might call on men with looser morals. Ellie folded that warning into plans already forming: gather witnesses, secure proof, and make such noise that corrupt papers could not stand alone against living testimony. They held a quiet meeting under a sagging porch roof, where Naya told a story about a spring named in an elder's song, and Amos promised to speak with a man who remembered when that spring still ran free. Lila organized a work party to mend fences in a week, and the boys practiced sounding the alarm bell so they would recognize urgency without panicking. Ellie kept the actual deeds hidden in an oiled biscuit tin beneath her shirt. She unwrapped that tin at night and traced names with a fingertip until they became real rather than abstract accusations. Sometimes she stood on a small rise and watched the town like a hawk, ledger pressed under her collar, considering how little a signature meant when people still remembered which well had belonged to whom. The tension increased with the sun's angle each day. Meals tasted like metal and sleep became a light thing, surrendering to every distant creak and rustle. Ellie rehearsed questions she might ask in public. Who remembers the old cottonwood? Which family fetched water here before labels changed? Which neighbor keeps a ledger in the attic? Those questions were weapons if delivered in the right order. Naya's tales became testimony. She would speak to anyone who would listen and name the springs that had fed her people when courts were less hungry for coin than for truth. When a small group of riders circled near dusk and then pulled back after spotting the lanterns, the moment brightened like a struck match, proof that visibility raised risk and reduced impunity. Ellie taught the boys to listen for distant hoofbeats and to report them without flinching. And she trained Amos to recognize the pattern of a man who had been hired rather than one who rode for survival. Those preparations were practical rather than theatrical. Alarms, witnesses, marked trees, and a careful accounting of names that might one day be called to swear under oath. One night the tin alarm did its crude work. A bell clattered and a string pulled loose, sending a hollow sound into the dark that woke neighbors and sent a squad of lights blinking toward the barn. The intruders fled into the shadows, leaving only hurried tracks in a toppled feed sack, a message rather than a conquest. Reed's agents had tested the perimeter and found resistance where they expected ease. That night the cabin felt both smaller and more resilient. Naya's breathing steadied and the men who had once been strangers sat shoulder to shoulder and plotted next move. Ellie considered filing a formal complaint with Sheriff Vance, but she knew the law could be bent when men paid well. Instead, she focused on gathering a chorus of witnesses whose memories could drown out counterfeit ink. She invited a weary farmer from the next valley to visit, knowing his recollection of a particular spring would carry weight. She wrote his testimony in careful script and hid a copy among quilts. The emotional stakes lodged beneath her ribs like an ember that refused to die. This was not merely about property but about the histories of families erased by neat contract. Ellie found herself asking a question aloud in moments of private fury and quiet resolve. Could someone truly stand and lose everything to reveal a wrong? She then asked that question of those around her not as a rhetorical flourish but as a call to action. Neighbors answered with small acts that became louder than speeches. Amos fixed hinges and swore to testify. Lila's boys kept watch at dusk, and a traveling preacher agreed to host a public meeting to air grievances. The cabin became an accidental courthouse of memory and intent, where stories were gathered like stones and sorted for weight and truth. Tension tightened into a cord that would not snap but could be plucked to sound the country. People began to feel themselves part of a pattern larger than individual fear. In the late hour before dawn, fresh boot prints ran too close to the stable, deliberate and sure, and Ellie set another alarm that would scatter feed and startle riders into retreat or reveal their faces. That alarm rang at midnight and neighbors rose like a single organism, lanterns bobbing, voices low but purposeful, and by dawn the only thing left was evidence of a probe, not a raid. Each small success hardened their resolve and taught Ellie the exact measure of courage needed to press on despite probable loss. By the week's end, Naya's strength returned enough for long stories without pause, and those narratives began to fold into legal memory as witnesses prepared to speak of what they had heard and seen. Ellie stood at sunset on a low hill, the ledger wrapped in oiled cloth against her chest, Coda beside her and Buck nearby. She asked the essential question to the prairie and to any listener: would you stand when truth asked for sacrifice? That question settled like a stone into the reader's hand, small and heavy, and the answer it demanded would not be simple or free. Stand firm. Reed's men arrived at a hard gallop, their horses carving fresh lines in the dry soil and stirring the ranch's weary dust into the air. Ellie stood on the porch with a rifle in her palm, sunburn and stubbornness etched on her face, the world narrowing to the sound of their voices. The leader rode forward and let his gaze run over the fence and barn as if appraising goods, lips twisting into a smile that lacked kindness. He dismounted with a practiced slowness and called without ceremony, demanding to know where the older woman was and why she had trespassed upon men of consequence. Ellie answered in a voice made of rope and iron, "Leave or bleed," and the words dropped from her like a stone into quiet water. A hush followed. Even Buck in the stable lifted his head and breathed shallow, sensing a threat carried in men rather than weather. One of the riders pushed forward and spat a threat meant to be a weapon, a promise masked as humor. But Naya's name on the leader's tongue felt like a bruise laid over an old sore. Ellie shifted her stance, finger near the trigger, but disciplined, her muscles remembering winter's repairs and a life built from plain grit. The leader laughed then, a sound without warmth, and said their business was to reclaim what papers and men of means said belonged to them. Ellie's reply was a single sharp report that cracked across the yard. The warning shot leapt over heads and buried itself in the far soil, sending birds into ragged sky. Horses panicked in the dust, riders flung back to leather, and for a moment the field resembled a storm rendered in hoof and breath. Buck snorted and surged, breaking for the barn in a movement so sudden. Some of Reed's men reeled, their balance unsettled by raw motion. The leader swore, then drew a Colt from beneath his coat, the metal glinting cold and certain in a hand accustomed to settling disputes. Reed's men spread like a small cloud of malice, circling with measured menace and throwing challenges that intended to wear away courage calmly held. Ellie and Naya moved through the day's remaining chores with the speed of those who must fortify homes against more than weather. They labored, nailed, and readied traps that would blunt a first charge. Naya taught Ellie a few measured phrases, short blessings that touched the ranch air like prayers and changed the rhythm of work into something older and steadier. They strung lanterns in unexpected places and rigged tin alarms that would clang louder than a man's shout, planning to turn every sound into evidence that neighbors could hear. Neighbors drifted in when dusk softened the edges, Amos carrying coils of wire and a stoic face, while others bore jars of stew and the quiet willingness to stand together. The first clash came with no grand trumpet, only a sudden charge as one rider misjudged the rigged snares and stumbled, dragging a broken wheel and a shout that scattered plans. Wood splintered when a bullet tore a fence post, and the sound of cracked cedar sounded to Ellie like the ranch taking a wound on her behalf. Coda bolted from her tether with a low, threatening cry, lungs hot and eyes furious as she surged into a group of riders, hooves hammering and throwing men sideways in a confusion of leather and spinning dust. Buck met the chaos with his own strength, rearing and charging a flank where rifles were readied, teeth bared and muscles coiled, a gelding who answered danger with the same blunt loyalty that had kept Ellie alive more than once. Gunfire stitched the afternoon with sharp, bitter intervals, smoke curled and hung, and the ranch yard became a map of soot and sudden holes in wood and leather. Amos and the boys worked as if they had trained for war, lifting a hitching bar, shoving a wagon wheel into a hole to slow a horse, and throwing themselves at tasks that bought seconds and saved lives. Naya stood near the sagging gate and took careful aim with a borrowed rifle, her hands steady and her breath measured, and her shot found a shoulder instead of a heart, as if precise mercy had guided its arc. Two of Reed's men crumpled to the ground with groans, and the worst of the attackers hesitated as the law of blood and consequence cut through their resolve. Reed himself rode close enough for Ellie to see the thin, pale vein in his temple and the certainty in his jaw. He barked orders like a man trying to conjure courage for others when he had little of his own. One of his lieutenants tried to flank the barn and met a tarp and a rope that snapped taut, dumping his mount in a heap, while neighbors rushed to secure the men who tried to stand again. The fight felt both immediate and ancient, as though years of wrongs and papered theft had condensed into the present and demanded a reckoning in real time. Ellie moved with a calm that surprised even her. She fired when necessary and kept her voice low, calling out names, urging the boys, and shifting barricades so that the wounded could be tended without surrendering strategic ground. The ground tasted of gunpowder and dust and the heat of men who felt entitled, and the ranch answered with the cohesion of people whose losses taught them to stand together. A rider grabbed for Naya, hands greedy and crude, but Ellie swung her rifle like a club and struck bone. The man dropped away, cursing with a face contorted by surprise that someone smaller might hurt him back. Naya moved through the fray with stories in her mouth and a steady hand, binding wounds, directing those who could run, and speaking old words that steadied frightened hearts more than any sermon. At one turn a boy fell and the world narrowed to that single sound of impact. Ellie slid to his side, ripped a strip from her shirt, and knelt as if she had always been born to that exact instant of mercy. The tide turned when Reed's horse reeled under a grazing shot and he found himself unbalanced. His plan dissolving into a scramble. A man suddenly made less than the suits he wore and the papers he kept. Men who had ridden with confidence now looked to the horizon and saw the impossible. Townsfolk bearing tool and witness. Women and men illuminated by lantern light and the truth that had been wrapped for too long in ink. Reed spat blood and cursed fate as he gave the order to fall back, desperation curdling into retreat, his men scattering to find ways to explain failure to pockets used to profit from others' silence. They rode off like a storm, losing teeth, dust swallowing their shapes until only the ragged marks of hooves and a single dropped glove remained to testify to their presence. In the aftermath, Ellie and Nia moved among the bent and bleeding, naming those who needed care, counting names like a ledger, while neighbors bound wounds, boiled water, and stayed ready. Ellie pried up a warped floorboard with a small knife, breathing slowly so the cabin's quiet would not leak suspicion. Dust rose in a pale veil, and the light from the lamp caught edges of paper stacked beneath maps with inked ridgelines. Deeds sealed with county stamps, a ledger whose corners had been softened by years. One map bore the spring's old name, the same syllables Nia had offered in song. Another drew a boundary that cut a furlong from the creek where children had chased minnows. Ink made the accusation plain where gossip had only circled. Nia's fingers trembled as she smoothed the deed and named men who had come with polite talk, whiskey, and offers meant to look like favors. She explained how clerks were paid to misfile originals and how signatures were copied over to give the illusion of continuity. Her voice was not theatrical but steady, a ledger of sorrow spoken aloud. Ellie felt the air change around her. The documents transformed rumor into a charge that could be brought to light. She wrapped a stack in oiled cloth and tucked it into an old biscuit tin, then slid the tin beneath a loose board in her own kitchen, a small coffin for truth. Coda lingered at the doorway, ears pricked toward ridgelines as if the mare could hear the world's intention. Buck paced the stall, a restless gauge against the shifting danger. News travels in small valleys and quicker than a courier. Men in town began to speak of misfiled papers, and an older clerk admitted a packet had been re-entered under a stranger's name. Ellie's anger softened into resolve. There were pragmatic steps to take beyond fury. Neighbors gathered at dusk with lamps and tools, and together they laid out the papers like a claim on the table. Amos brought an oil lamp and a stout jaw. Lila placed photographs she'd kept in a trunk, images of the cottonwood and a child paddling in a shallow pool. The community set to work matching signatures and dates, pointing out where the ink had been altered and margins had been erased. One map showed a deceit so plain it felt obscene. A deed that sliced through a communal watering place and attached it to a man who had never fetched a pail there. Those facts grounded their outrage. Theft was not a myth, but a method. Ellie began to catalog witnesses, marking names and times in a small book. She taught the boys how to notice details. The color of a fence post when it was first painted. An unusual knot in the cottonwood's bark, whether the spring ran clear or mossy in late summer. Such particulars build the bones of testimony. Nia told stories between chores, each one a map in itself, where elders once left offerings, which family used the spring to baptize their children, and what the creek looked like in drought years. Those stories supplied memory where ink had been used to erase it. Fresh tracks appeared near the corral one morning, wide treads in a cart scar gouging the turf. They traced a path that suggested scouts rather than random travelers. Reed's men had not only filed papers but measured fences and tested defenses. Ellie photographed prints in measured stride with a rod she had fashioned for the purpose. She wrote notes about shoe patterns and wheel widths, small proofs that could tie a man to a place. Every trace mattered because originals could be burned or stolen. Artifacts left behind proved presence when documents vanished. The neighbors began to make duplicates of key papers, copying maps by hand and stowing copies in 3 separate secret caches. They hid one in the loft of Amos's shed, another beneath the preacher's pulpit, and a third inside a hollow post at the grain house. Ellie practiced the words she would use in public. She learned to present facts without fire because a practiced liar could manipulate anger. She called witnesses to remember specific provable things: the precise tree at the spring's edge, a faded stone with initials, a photograph taken on a summer day. The plan was not romantic but practical. Mount memories so it would outlast forged ink. Coda's behavior became a kind of weather vane. The mare would not stray far from the cabin, and would snort and turn when riders passed over a ridge. Her watchfulness a small mercy. Buck's restlessness grew into a tension that made Ellie check tack and sharpen tools. The geldings seemed to measure the risk with hoofbeats. At night the alarm they had rigged sent a tin clatter into the hollow that made intruders think twice. Once 3 riders pulled back when light bobbed and lanterns winked along hedgerows. They left a scrap of cloth and a thin shoe, items that would later help name faces should those men brave the light again. Ellie found herself asking the same hard question at odd hours. How many other springs had been diverted? How many families pushed to thirst by signed papers and quiet? She posed that question aloud in the cabin's dimness as if speaking to herself and to any listener. Would you stand against greed knowing you might lose everything? The question landed on neighbors like a gauntlet. Their responses were simple acts rather than grand vows. Amos would attest to what he remembered at the county meeting. Lila promised to bring a photograph and her father's testimony, and the boys rehearsed names until their voices did not waver. Public testimony would be dangerous. Reed's allies could intimidate or bribe, but private acquiescence meant more springs would vanish next season. So they made visibility their weapon, gathering witnesses, pinning maps to public walls, marking trees, and calling a meeting at the grain house, where many could attest to what had been. Naya taught Ellie a phrase meaning the land remembers, and Ellie used it to rally neighbors, reminding them that memory held weight beyond ink. The plan solidified into a timetable. Copies were secured, witness lists collated, a lawyer was primed to file complaints, and a public meeting was scheduled, with notices pinned to tavern doors. On the morning she set out for town with a small map in her satchel and Coda's head against her hip, Ellie felt the weight of history and the pressure of choice. She had the deeds hidden, witnesses ready, and a question that would have to be answered in public when truth demands sacrifice. Who will stand and who will turn away? That night Ellie sat on the ridge with a lamp, letting anger settle into resolve. She pictured families carrying water farther because springs had been stolen, and the thought tightened her chest. She asked aloud the question she had carried. How many have been crushed by polite papers and hidden hands? Would you stand and risk everything to reveal a wrong? Neighbors answered with small commitments. Amos would testify, Lila would bring a photograph, and the boys would learn names until they could speak them steadily. Coda rested her head against Ellie's knee. Buck snorted like a Ellie hid the tin beneath the floorboard, shouldered a map and rode toward town, determined to make memory speak against ink firmly. Ellie's defiance stirred the valley like wind, flattening loose grain, and neighbors arrived bearing what they could spare. Amos came first with a coiled length of wire and a burlap sack of nails, his face set in a practical resolve forged by years of honest work. Lila followed, carrying a steaming pot, her 2 boys trailing, eager to help, though their hands were still learning. A carpenter from the next road offered spare hinges and a stout mallet, and a widow brought jars of preserves with a quiet promise to watch the perimeter each night. Coda studied the newcomers from the lean-to, lifting her head to appraise each face before allowing a cautious approach. Buck accepted strangers with blunt patience, permitting bridles to be adjusted and hooves to be checked, his steady breathing a comfort that ordinary routines could persist despite danger. The animals became an honest gauge of intent. When Coda allowed a boy to braid a forelock, neighbors relaxed because the mare had given assent. Naya reshaped the ranch by speaking of place as memory rather than commodity. She sat on a low crate and named the cottonwood by the spring, the hollow where trout lingered in summer, and the stone marker carved by a family long gone, and each name made the country feel like a lineage rather than a ledger. Listening, neighbors began to see land as a relationship and responsibility, and that shift altered how they prepared and whom they defended. Ellie hid the deeds beneath a roof joist and memorized guilty names by lantern light, repeating signatures until letters lay easy on her tongue. She pinned a crude map to the cabin wall and neighbors added marks where elders pointed, turning rumor into charted detail. Amos lent a store ledger for formal entries, and Lila sewed loose photographs into a bound scrapbook that served as an archive of proof. They copied maps by hand to preserve peculiarities a forger might miss and hid duplicates in separate caches, so proof could not be seized at once. Labor blurred into companionship as work produced conversation and frequent coffee. Men who once exchanged nods in passing lingered to share tools and to trade stories of hard seasons and small mercies, and those memories gave texture to testimony. A neighbor recalled a summer when a particular well ran clear while others failed, and another produced an old receipt that mentioned a boundary line now denied. Such domestic particulars would later undercut tidy forgeries by anchoring claims to lived habit. The widow organized a watch schedule so someone would always listen for strange hooves, and a teacher from town volunteered to copy documents neatly so they would read cleanly in court. An itinerant preacher agreed to raise a moral question from the pulpit, so townsfolk would consider justice beyond profit. Practical plans took shape: duplicate papers, gather witnesses, schedule a public meeting at the grain house, and rehearse concise statements to withstand official scrutiny. Coda and Buck adapted to the crowded routine, their instincts woven into the ranch's defenses. At dawn, Buck nudged Ellie and stood watch while neighbors moved past the feed trough, measuring each face as if inventorying allies. The mare patrolled slow loops along the property edge, nostrils, tasting wind and ears flicking at unfamiliar sounds, and neighbors learned what each posture meant. A head raised twice signified passing travelers. A tense shuffle indicated scouting. Those small signals became a reliable warning system that reduced panic and improved response time. Naya organized evenings of remembrance that served as ritual and record. Under a low lamp, she invited each person to name one memory of the spring. A specific image, a date, or a child's name, and scribes recorded those recollections into a bound volume of communal testimony. Converting private memory into public evidence gave ordinary recollection weight in any future dispute, and turned anecdote into corroboration that would be difficult to dismiss. The practice also strengthened morale. Naming what had been taken made grief communal and resolve sharp. Ellie taught the boys to track and measure prints accurately, noting shoe patterns and wheel scars, while Amos cataloged receipts that corroborated oral histories. Lila arranged photographs in order and learned to recite names and dates with a steady voice, practicing until recitation became natural rather than theatrical. Neighbors practiced delivering short factual statements rather than long invective, so their testimony would appear credible before officials unfamiliar with rural life. Even amid labor, a low hum of tension persisted as rumors of hired hands in a lawyer's interest reached the valley. But those rumors intensified preparedness rather than eroding resolve. Visibility became a weapon as fences stood truer. Paths were cleared and the spring's old name returned to common speech, stripping secrecy from the theft. The community transformed into a node within a wider network of small lives bound to land. That change showed in straightened posts, swept yards, and conversations that included plans for defense. As days passed, practical solidarity produced tangible outcomes. A boarded well, repaired fences, and copies of documents tucked into the lofts of trusted neighbors. People who had been solitary now moved as a coordinated group, and their shared labor felt less like charity and more like mutual preservation. The work produced pride and readiness. Neighbors ate together by lantern light, spoke of evidence and witness, and quiet solidarity grew into a more effective defense than any single barricade. One evening, they stood along a repaired fence and looked toward the ridgeline and felt that simple axe, nailing a board, bringing stew, saving a photograph, had accumulated into a practical justice. Trust had been built through ordinary gestures, and a plan had been drawn in shared memory. They had turned fear into preparation and private remembering into public proof. The valley seemed altered not by spectacle but by the steady accumulation of small, resolute acts that would be difficult to undo. In the long dusk, Ellie watched neighbors move through chores with the concentration of people who had found purpose together, and she felt a heavy relief that their readiness might be enough. She had wanted allies and found a small army of determined neighbors, each offering what they could labor, witness, a place to hide a duplicate, a voice to speak truth to power. They had built not only a defense for a spring but a living record that could be carried before any court and into public memory, and that record owed more to ordinary hands than to dramatic gesture. By nightfall, the ranch no longer looked solitary. Lanterns dotted the yard and Coda stood near the gate as if keeping watch over a new kinship. Ellie believed the community's readiness had shifted the landscape itself, where secrecy once allowed theft to flourish. Communal memory and mutual aid had begun to close the gaps forged in reliance upon. They had become something larger than neighbors, a network of testimony, a congregation of memory, and a practical guard against quiet theft. They vowed to stand together, come what may, until truth reclaimed the springs, and families could drink from remembered waters again, freely and openly. Their stubborn, steady work promised a future where children fetched water without fear. Dawn broke pale across the prairie, turning every ridge and fence post into a sharp silhouette against thin light. The alarm bell clanged and neighbors answered immediately, lanterns bobbing as men and women took their stations. Naya stood at the gate with a quiet face, her hands steady on a borrowed rifle while Amos tightened wire and the carpenter hefted a plank. The two boys crouched behind hay bales, swallowing fear and rehearsing the names of people they vowed to protect. Riders appeared over the ridge like dark punctuation, horses smelling of road and iron and purpose. The attackers rode with the confidence of men who believed signatures and money granted them authority to claim any plot. A volley of shots ripped the morning, and a fence splintered into a scatter of wood and dust. Buck reared and surged into a flank, his broad chest driving between horse and rider with the blunt power of an animal that loved its rider. Coda burst from the lean-to and charged through a line, hooves beating leather and earth, scattering satchels and disrupting plans. Violence in the yard had no glamour. It arrived as quick choices and blunt consequences that demanded immediate practical responses. Ellie met danger with a precision that had been honed by years of hard mornings and harder losses. She fired measured rounds that dropped two men and halted a planned surge before it could gain momentum. Those shots bought neighbors time to heave a feed wagon into place, creating a narrow funnel where horses stumbled in soft ground. Naya's aim was steady. She wounded a shoulder and turned a reaching hand away from a rifle. Tools became tactics. Planks were bolted into barricades. A wheel was jammed into a rut to trap a flank, and a barrel was tipped to form cover. Neighbors moved like parts of a single machine, each small action reducing the attacker's advantage and buying seconds for aid. Smoke curled from a corner of the barn where embers had landed, and the scent of char cut the air with sharp insistence. Lila's voice rose over the din, clear and commanding as she handed out water and ordered the boys to bind wounds. Amos and the carpenter jammed a wheel into a soft patch, slowing the horse and allowing others to pull the rider free and cuff his hands with rope. The attackers had trained to take undefended prizes, not to face a community that converted ordinary objects into coordinated defenses. Reed rode forward with a face that expected obedience, barking orders designed to instill fear into others and straighten wavering men. But his presence only tightened the defenders' resolve. His lieutenant fell to a shot that made other riders glance to one another in doubt. Animals reshaped the battle. Buck unseated riders and Koda's charge split formations, creating confusion that no planned assault could easily handle. A terrified mount can undo an organized charge faster than strategy ever imagined, and several horses bucked and slid into churned earth. The boys learned exact chores in the midst of chaos, hauling water, passing bandages, and marking footprints for later testimony. Amos photographed a dropped glove and wrote names as neighbors recited faces and remembered voices, turning immediate facts into durable proof. Every small act mattered because forged documents could be hidden, but footprints and witness accounts persisted as stubborn traces. A rider tried to force toward a hiding place where children crouched, and Ellie stepped into the line without hesitation and fired. The man collapsed, and the collapse altered the attacker's tone from brashness to caution. They found bravery less easy to marshal. Reed shouted and threatened, but his voice sounded thin beneath tin alarms and the chorus of neighbors naming what they defended. The attackers faltered when plans conflicted with people who knew the land and refused to cede it quietly. One rider reached in desperation, and a neighbor struck him with the butt of a rifle, sending him sprawling amid cries and dust. Neighbors worked with efficiency born from necessity, binding wounds while improvising defenses and clearing paths for the wounded to be moved. Smoke made silhouettes of men and horses, and a corner of the barn smoldered, sending sparks that skittered across the yard like small judgment. At a critical moment, a mounted attacker misjudged footing, and Buck's flank closed against him, throwing rider and saddle into a heap. Reed's men slowed and hesitation spread. Men who had expected quick spoils began to weigh the risk of lingering in a place now watched. Orders to fall back were given with a brittle edge, and Reed's retreat became a scrambling of shapes swallowed by dust. They left behind a satchel, a crushed hat, a bent spur, and a few footprints that would later help name faces. The defenders gathered what evidence remained, cataloging marks, noting accents and tattoos, and saving fragments that might tie men to claims later brought before officials. Neighbors dressed wounds with the calm force of people who had learned to keep moving in the hardest hour. Naya murmured ancient phrases that steadied more than blood, and Ellie moved among the hurt with brisk, precise hands, issuing tight instructions. Young hands learned how to describe a shoe tread without melodrama, and how to recite a time and a place in steady tone. Amos kept a ledger of items and faces, while Lila organized shelter and food for those who could not travel that day. They converted improvisation into evidence by copying maps, hiding duplicates in separate caches, and gathering photographs to corroborate oral memory. The conversation shifted from immediate survival to planning consequences. Neighbors practiced giving sober, specific statements so that their testimony would hold up under any scrutiny. The yard bore scars, splintered posts, singed rafters, and churned earth, but those scars also marked a community that had refused to be cowed. In the quiet aftermath, children dozed against their mothers and men traded tools. The light seemed steadier than it had at dawn. Ellie stood with grit on her palms and a bandage stained with iron and asked aloud a question she had been carrying. "Have you ever risked everything for someone else?" That question landed in faces around her and found answers in actions. Amos's jaw hardened as if to promise testimony. Naya's eyes answered with the weight of generations who had protected water and story, and the boys straightened, their posture turning into a silent vow. Reed limped away that morning with pride wounded and fewer options. His men dispersed with bruised certainty and diminished swagger. The ranch would require long weeks of repair and nights would remain watchful, but the morning's clash had shifted the valley's moral balance. Ordinary people acting together had drawn a line that forged ink alone could not redraw without contest. The work of repair began immediately, plank by plank, post by post. Neighbors traded tools in stew, and children collected stray nails and strung them for later use. They rehearsed their testimony by lamplight and prepared copies of maps and names to carry to clerks and anyone who would listen beyond the county line. The valley's story would travel from porch to tavern to courthouse, not as a rumor but as a ledger of facts, witness statements, and photographs. In the following days, the community held watches, patched fences, and taught the boys to recognize subtle markers at the spring's edge that a forger would miss. Naya taught a phrase that meant the land remembers, and neighbors used it to steady each other as they turned grief into a deliberate record. That work stitched people together in a way that paper never could. Shared labor created a durable safety sewn from muscle and memory rather than signatures. At night in the cabin, they recorded names and dates beneath an oil lamp, converting private recollection into a public archive that would be harder to erase. Ellie cleaned her rifle with slow, precise motions and listened to her neighbors plan their next steps, feeling a clarity that came from having acted rather than having feared. The question she had asked echoed in her bones: risk everything for another, and what does that cost if not time, blood, and sleep? Neighbors answered that question without speeches by keeping watch, promising testimony, offering food, and binding wounds, actions more eloquent than words. The valley had been altered not only by splintered wood but by a new readiness to resist future threats together. Reed's failed raid left a lesson. Documents could be contested when living testimony and preserved evidence made claims provable and visible. The ranch bore the scars of the fight, but it also bore a new confidence grown in the ordinary work of people who had chosen to stand. In the weeks that followed, they mended what was torn and rehearsed testimony at the grain house, so officials would hear facts rather than fury. Children learned to identify a particular stone by the spring and to describe its exact position so that memory would be precise rather than hazy. Neighbors vowed to carry copies of maps to the preacher and the clerk and to speak plainly about what they had seen and who had come. The day had cost them much, but it had returned something essential: proof that courage shared can blunt predatory certainty. By dusk, the ranch held a quiet that felt like both exhaustion and a promise. Coda grazed and Buck stood near the gate, steady as a sentinel. Ellie watched neighbors move through chores with the steadiness of people who had found purpose together, and she felt a relief that was rough and deep. The question she had posed remained, a quiet challenge to any listener. Have you ever risked everything for someone else? And if so, what did you gain? And what did you lose? Answers came in acts more than words, and in a community that now bore the marks of both cost and fierce hope. They promised to stand again if anyone tried to steal water or story, binding their future with witness and labor always together. Ellie stitched by lamp and whiskey, hands steady despite the long hours and the raw ache under her ribs. The yard bore scars from the recent fight: splintered fence posts, singed rafters, and churned dry earth where horses had skidded. Neighbors lay on cots and quilts, breathing even and slow, their wounds wrapped in coarse cloth and quiet companionship. Sheriff Vance arrived before noon, dusty and deliberate, placing a sober hat shadow over tired eyes as he stepped into the cabin's dim. He warned that Reed possessed influence in legal corridors and hired men who thought violence a reasonable business expense. Vance promised to file complaints and press for records, admitting protection could be limited where money moved freely. Ellie listened without flinch, letting caution and law meet her stubborn decision that truth must be made visible in public. She set the oiled tin on the table and unwrapped the deeds and maps that proved a spring's theft and names falsified by ink. The paper became an accusation in the lamplight. Signatures showed tampering where a clerk had smoothed them and a man had paid for convenience. Neighbors clustered around the evidence, Amos reciting ledger fragments and Lila producing a photograph of children by the cottonwood. Those recollections knit into a human ledger stronger than forged papers because memory carried witness and specificity. Nanio, recovering, spoke of ancestral names and taught brief phrases that anchored the land in language rather than ledger. Her words carried weight. They stitched culture and claim together, giving neighbors new terms to name what had been taken. Practical steps taken, copies were made, duplicates hidden in separate locations, and witnesses rehearsed their statements for formal affidavits. Ellie insisted on precise details: dates, tree notches, watercolor in certain months, small facts that resist forgery and alter testimony. The sheriff agreed to deliver affidavits and to nudge a clerk to re-examine suspicious entries, but he could not promise swift justice. So the community blended legal motion with grassroots readiness. Watches at dawn and dusk, lanterns to signal alarms across ridges. Neighbors learned to listen for hoofbeats and to read animal cues. Coda's restless posture became an informal alarm while Buck stood sentinel. Work shifted from solitary chores to coordinated defense. Men hammered through the evening, Women prepared food for those who mended and watched. The ranch felt less isolated as practical labor knitted strangers into allies. Ordinary tasks became the architecture of resistance. They hid copies in hollow posts, inside hymnals, and beneath stable boards. Redundancy became safety against sudden seizure. A farmer from the next valley signed a sworn note, remembering the spring's flow decades earlier, and a teacher volunteered to transcribe statements neatly. Naya organized evenings of remembrance, where each person named an image associated with spring, transforming private memories into public records. Those stories became evidence, small details forming corroboration that a court could not easily dismiss when paired with maps and photographs. The sheriff's presence lent official weight. He logged names and dates, promising to begin the formal process while neighbors prepared to carry proof to town. Ellie felt pride threaded with apprehension when Naya called her a warrior. The honor was tender but came with a quiet contract of continued vigilance. She accepted the title because it matched the work ahead, not a single heroic act, but ongoing labor to protect community water and history. The emotional price surfaced in private moments, sleepless hours, sudden flares of anger, and the knowledge that greed could escalate from ink to violence. Yet the neighbors responded with small commitments: testify at hearings, host copies, and ride to the clerk's office if intimidation arose. They rehearsed statements until the details came easily and practiced composure so that their testimony would be credible in front of officials. At dusk, children learned to identify a particular stone by the spring and to recite its position without theatrics. The mundane formed legal ballot. Amos kept a ledger of evidence and items recovered. Lila organized the quilted archive of photographs, and the boys collected stray items left by attackers. Those fragments, gloves, a bent spur, a torn strap, became threads that could tie men to the place should a subpoena demand faces and proof. Coda grazed near the gate and allowed a careful braid from the carpenter's son, her calm acceptance signaling that the mayor trusted these new allies. Buck stood always at the fence line as dusk fell, a patient sentinel whose presence steadied hands that might otherwise shake in the face of long nights. Legal steps progressed. Affidavits were sworn. A hearing was scheduled on the county calendar, and the sheriff promised to escort a delegation if threats escalated. Community measures remained vital. Lantern networks were used to warn of approaching horse riders. Scouts rode night circuits, and cached copies were moved regularly. Ellie stored a sealed second copy beneath a stone at the old well and entrusted another to the preacher, who agreed to hide it inside a sermon book. They converted everyday practices into protective strategies. Sharing meals became a cover for witness interviews, and quilting evenings doubled as record sessions. The ranch still bore battle marks, but those scars now testified to resistance rather than defeat, and the sight of repaired posts signaled resilience to any observer. In quieter hours, Ellie considered the sacrifice justice might demand, measuring nights lost and the risk of further violence against the legacy of water secured for future children. The question, "What would you sacrifice to stand for truth?" sat like a settled stone in her mouth each dawn, and neighbors answered not with rhetoric but deeds. They volunteered to ride to town, to speak plainly at a hearing, to keep the lantern watch, and to hide duplicates where officials could not easily seize them. Naya's phrase, "land remembers," became a rallying punctuation, a reminder that memory carried legal force when properly marshaled and recorded. In the morning, a small party rode toward the county seat. The mayor nudged Ellie, and the gelding neighed in steady support. Ellie tucked Naya's river-smooth charm beneath her shirt and mounted, feeling the tang of fear braided with resolve, knowing that the path ahead would require patience and courage. They moved as a compact force. Witnesses carried copies. A farmer held a sworn note. A teacher bore transcribed statements, and neighbors were ready to attest in public. As they left the yard, Coda watched from the gate until their silhouettes receded into heat and dust, an animal sentinel guarding a fragile homegrown peace. Ellie felt the deeds as a weight that steadied. She had chosen memory over silence and accepted the risk that came with it. In the cabin's dim, when the lantern guttered low, she whispered the phrase she had learned and let rest come slowly, knowing tomorrow would demand more work but also trusting in shared resolve. Neighbors would carry testimony, and the sheriff would press documents into the officials' hands. The fight had shifted from a private skirmish to a public record, where ink could be cross-checked against memory. She curled on the mattress with the tin hidden beneath, Coda breathing nearby, and slept knowing that standing for truth had begun to change the valley. Spring greened the prairie in slow, determined bands that made Ellie feel as if the land forgave small sins and offered a fresh ledger to write upon. She rebuilt fence lines post by patient post, drove new posts deep where rot had loosened the old, and hammered rails straight until the pasture read like a faithful map, while her herd recovered beneath careful feeding and steady watch, calves pressing at gates, and cows regaining weight under disciplined ration and gentle attention. Coda found new speed along a ridge and raced like a rumor through air that had once only known scarcity. Mane catching late light, and Buck stayed close at the gate, a steady presence that comforted in ways that mattered most at dusk. Naya turned the cabin into a place of repair and story, gathering neighbors in evenings to speak of springs and old markers so the land's memory would travel in voices as well as papers. Travelers came with coins and hidden receipts and photographs unearthed from trunks, small artifacts that stitched private recollection into public narrative, while Sheriff Vance moved through the valley with careful attention, promising process in slow legal gears but warning that men with money often stretched influence like a shadow across rooms where truth should live. Ellie and neighbors preferred living witness in photographs to ink that could be smoothed and sold, copying maps by hand and hiding duplicates in separate caches to frustrate sudden seizure. The county hearing was a modest room of polished wood and clipped faces, yet particulars named by those who had used the spring for decades. An initial carved in a cottonwood, a notched stone, a child's photo at a pool, refused to be smoothed into silence and made testimony carry weight that forged documents lacked. Witnesses learned to speak with practiced calm, stating dates, marks, and exact details. So memory became credible fact, and a teacher read aloud a sworn note from a far farmer who remembered the spring running clear. Reed lurked in town like a private menace, buying favors and keeping men at edges. But public scrutiny narrowed his path and raised costs for those who thought signatures bought silence. A judge ordered contested transfers re-examined and required fuller authentication of deeds, a partial victory that did not end danger but made predation a riskier trade. Neighbors organized lantern networks and scheduled watches so vigilance became routine rather than panic, rehearsing testimony until memory resisted cross-examination, and redundancy treated proof like a living thing, rather than a single vulnerable object. Coda patrolled edges with quiet attention like a sentry, and Buck stood at gates with noble patience, while children learned to name a spring with exact markers that would carry weight in court. Evenings at the cabin became instruction as Naya taught phrases that anchored land to language and children learned to recite specific locations, turning private memory into public evidence. Travelers sought counsel rather than spectacle and sometimes left affidavits or coins or photographs that tied a family name to a place once erased. Ellie stored primary deeds beneath a floorboard and entrusted duplicates to trusted hands, educating neighbors to keep copies hidden and rotate caches, so a sudden raid could not erase proof in a single sweep. Slow labor repaired barns and posts and mended trust through ordinary work, and the sheriff escorted delegations when intimidation rose, while a county clerk began to note anomalies that hinted at wider scrutiny beyond the valley. Letters arrived from distant kin and strangers moved by the story, offering tools, affidavits, or small loans, and each small support braided Valley's claim tighter into public record. Summer burned into gold and the ranch thrummed with harvest hope. Calves grew into yearlings and stores filled, and the yard hummed with a guarded peace built from shared labor rather than complacency. Neighbors kept daytime tasks and night watches. Readiness became a habit, and the community's small victories shifted the valley's moral math, making theft costlier where memory and map were visible together. One afternoon, a photograph arrived tying a name on the deeds to a family once thought lost, a private vindication that folded into public memory and made testimony harder to dismiss. Ellie called neighbors for a simple supper and asked each to answer the question she had carried through hard months. What will you do when power comes to take what you hold dear, and how will you stand? Responses were quiet promises of testimony, shelter, and labor, hands offered rather than rhetoric. That night they ate stew, mended fences by lamplight, and let children chase a wooden hoop while Coda watched and Buck guarded the gate. Like a promise, Ellie kept her rifle out of respect for necessity, teaching boys to honor its weight and to choose testimony over bravado, and Naya's voice rose sometimes in the dark, singing their talisman Land Remembers, which stitched memory to law. The sheriff's desk began to show small administrative tremors as clerks re-examined past packets, and officials found maps and photographs difficult to dismiss when matched by witnesses who named particular stones, notch, and the color of water in certain months. Travelers who had once laughed at frontier tales now sought counsel about preserving springs and recording memory in legally durable ways. And Ellie watched Coda race a distant horizon and felt the steady satisfaction of someone who had kept a promise to a community that would drink from a reclaimed spring before harvest. She rode to the county seat with witnesses and a teacher carrying transcribed statements. And when a clerk examined maps and photos, he found corroboration that made forged ink lose easy power. The braided work of law and living memory had become something durable. Victory partial and precarious, yet enough to force a reckoning. And while challenges would return, the valley had learned to meet them with facts, community, and preparation. In late light, neighbors gathered as children recited the spring's exact position with care. Voices steady and proud, and Ellie asked any traveler within earshot to take action, share this story, stand when power threatens, testify when truth needs voice, and be ready to protect memory. Because ordinary people together can alter the course of greed. Share Ellie's story, stand for just, testify where truth needs voice. Protect community memory, and ask yourself, when power comes to take, will you risk loss to defend what matters most?